Okay, so a little boy had made a little boat. There we go. He painted it up, fixed it beautifully, nice string for the sails, nice clean material. Only one day, someone stole it. He was very distressed. And it was some time later that he was walking along the street, still thinking, oh, I've lost my boat, when he happened to see in the window of a shop a boat that looked very, very like his boat. In fact, as he looked more carefully, he realized it was his boat. And so he ran into the shop and went, "That's my boat!" "No," said the shopkeeper. "It's mine. I bought it." "No," said the boy, "it is mine. I made it." "Well," said the shopkeeper, "if you pay me £15, you can have it." Now that was a lot of money for the boy. It would take him weeks and weeks to save up enough. But he resolved he was going to have his boat back. So he cut grass and did chores of all kinds and eventually had his money. He ran down to the shop, went in and said, holding his money, "I want my boat." He paid the money, received his boat, and he took the boat in his arms, hugged it, and went, "You dear little boat, I love you. You are mine. You are twice mine. I made you, and now I have bought you." Now that little story is made up, but helps us to get to the point of the big idea of the chapter that Ian just read for us. But that is the final chapter of a bigger story that up here we've been looking at for the last 3 weeks. And if you've been in Sunday Club, you've looked at it over the last 2 weeks. So before we go any further, it's that time. It's time for a recap. But the good news is, it's not coming from me. I've got a quick video that will do most of the recap for me.
God's story, Ruth. So part of God's story is about a woman named Ruth, and it begins like this. Ruth lived in a place called Moab and was married to a guy who was part of God's special family, the Israelites. A few years later, though, Ruth's husband died. Instead of returning to her family, which would have been expected, she stayed with Naomi, her husband's mom. Naomi tried to get Ruth to go back to her family in Moab, but Ruth wouldn't leave Naomi, no matter what. In fact, she wanted to go back to Israel with her. Ruth said, "Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God." So they both returned to Naomi's home in Bethlehem. Back then, though, it was hard for women to find work. Usually, they had to be taken care of by their husband or a dad. It's really hard to imagine that now, but Naomi and Ruth might not have even known how they'd survive. At first, to get food, Ruth went to the fields of a man named Boaz and followed his harvesters around. If they dropped anything, even just a piece of grain, she picked it up. This was called gleaning. Ruth worked from morning to night and barely even took a break. Boaz noticed. He told his workers to leave behind some extra grain for her to gather. When Naomi heard about this, she was overjoyed because Boaz was Naomi's relative and what's called a family redeemer. That meant that it was his responsibility to take care of his family. If anybody was going to rescue Ruth and Naomi, it was Boaz. Anyway, this gave Naomi an idea. She told Ruth to put on her best clothes and perfume and then go to the place where Boaz was sleeping. Naomi said that once Boaz had gone to sleep, Ruth should lay down by his feet. Now, this may sound like a weird plan, but it was actually really brave. Ruth trusted Naomi and obeyed.
Well, when Boaz woke up in the middle of the night with his feet uncovered, because that's what Ruth had done, he asked who was there. Ruth said, "I am your servant, Ruth." And she replied, "Spread the corner of your garment over me, as you are a guardian redeemer of my family." And we thought last week how that phrase was basically saying, you are the closest family that I know of that can look after us. And the way to look after people in those days was to marry them so that the land could be kept for the family land, and that children could be born so that the family would continue. And Boaz said, yes, but. You see, he said, yes, I'm willing to do it. I will look after Naomi, you, and make sure your family is provided for. But because this was a law provision in ancient Israel, actually there was a family member closer who had the first right to be able to buy the land. And so whilst he gave Ruth a generous gift and said, go back to Naomi, I'll sort it today, we finished the chapter going, oh dear, we don't know what's going to happen next. Well, Ian read what happened next for us. We've gone on a journey from what was ruin at the start of the story, because Elimelech and his family, they just hadn't foreseen how bad things could get. From one point of view, this has been a story that fits with exactly what the land of Israel was like at the time. The book tells us it's in the time of the Judges, which is the previous book in the Bible. And we're told that that time there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. But as you can imagine, not everybody sees with the same eyes and thinks the same things are right. So what I think is right in my eyes might be different to what you think is right in your eyes, will be different to what someone else thinks. And that meant Israel basically descended at times into a lawless, God-forgetting, dangerous place. When Naomi's husband Elimelech died, when Ruth's husband Mahlon died, and when her sister, fellow sister-in-law Orpah's husband had died, they were left with nothing because no one could inherit the land. And so they were completely ruined. That's why Ruth has been gleaning all the way through this story. But here's where we get to the big idea of the chapter. In fact, this is the big idea of the book. We're going from ruin, we said in this series, to redemption, which is a word that means to buy back, like the boy in our story. Even though something, perhaps it was not right that he would have to pay that money, he was willing to spend it to get back something that was very precious. It's the idea of getting back something that has been sold or forfeited. When something has been redeemed, you can have it back. Redemption is something that happens in hopeless situations. That's what Ruth and Naomi's life was. Still is at this point in the book. It is to redeem someone is the idea of going and finding a hopeless situation, making their interest your own responsibility, and paying the price of putting the situation right again, putting something that is wrong right again. As Christians, we believe that's what the Lord Jesus did for us on the cross. He came into our world because we were in a hopeless situation, completely at war and at odds with God, because we had said, no, we want your world, but not you. And he made the punishment for that action that we had taken his responsibility. And he took that punishment and made it possible for us to be forgiven and to be redeemed. For God to have us back as his friends rather than those who had chosen to be his enemies. Well, we're going to think about what some of the sections of the passage means later. But before that, I have for you a little quiz. Okay? Now, and just to double check, has everybody got at least 4 fingers? No one's lost any this morning. Good, right, okay. Because you're going to need those for this quiz. I'm going to ask 10 questions, and there's 4 possible answers, so you need to put up if you think it's answer 1, if you think it's answer 2, if you think it's answer 3, and if you think it's answer 4. Nothing complicated, like saying put number 2 fingers up if you think number 3 is right. No, we'll not do that. Just whatever number you think is right. Now, as we go, the wrong answers will start to disappear to help you know what is the right answer. Now, for the tech team, if you're going to want to put the PC volume on quite low, because I'm going to talk over it and leave my mic on if you don't mind, but we'll leave the settings as they are. So, this is just going to play right through 10 questions back to back. See how well you do. Oh, I do something. I'll just put my notes where I can't see them. Silly person. So we've been going through the story of Ruth and Boaz. Possibly we've been rooting for them to get together since we heard the week before that Boaz is a potential redeemer. And last week we heard that he is willing to take on at great cost the land and Ruth as his wife in order to provide for them. But the passage here starts with the meeting of two potential redeemers. And so maybe as we were reading it, we started to worry that, well, maybe it doesn't turn out okay. After all, they've had a hard life so far. What's to think that it's not going to work out? Not only that, if Boaz wants to do this and the other guy finds out, well, surely he could drive a hard bargain, couldn't he? He could play with Boaz's emotions. And so what we see is a conversation handled with great skill and planning. But the apparently accidental meeting that the other relative turns up at as the gate happens in exactly the place where ancient matters of business and finance were conducted. And it happens in full view of all the city leaders. There will be a decision out of this that no one can argue with. The only question is, what will the decision be? Now, was anybody wondering, who's the other guy? Did you notice that he's not named? In a chapter that is all about preserving names, particularly the family name, is rubbed out of history. Which should at least give us some hope that maybe he won't be around too long. Should suggest that he's not important. What his appearance does mean is the question, can Boaz redeem Ruth, will be answered. Boaz will redeem the land and take Ruth as his wife. And so as we think about this big idea of redemption, which is something that happens in this story, but is something God is still doing today, the first thing we learn is that redemption is costly. Boaz is ready for negotiation. He brings everything up very carefully. And so that when the contract is signed, he gets everything he wants in a fair and above board way. The wedding can go ahead. It's been a year or so of people wondering, can weddings go ahead? I can remember listening to interviews of people saying, we'd planned to get married. Weddings are currently illegal. And because we're Christians and we won't live together until we're married, and we'd given notice, one of us is about to be homeless. Thankfully, that wedding did eventually happen with only a short delay. And in this case, all that we need to wait for is the exchanging of the shoe, which, as we heard earlier, was basically the equivalent of signing a contract with witnesses. So the council of the witnesses, the contract is signed. How did the negotiation happen? Well, since it was signed with a shoe, you should notice there were some shoe boxes in the room. So let's think through how Boaz made his argument. And for that, who's got the box that says verses 3 to 4 and then a number 1 in brackets? Can anyone see the shoebox with that one? I think it is that one. Would somebody like to open it and tell me what was in, this is, think deal or no deal, what was in box 1 of Boaz's negotiation? It's a picture of some wheat. The land is what happened. Boaz says, hey, this is family land. One of us needs to buy it. Well, that doesn't sound so bad, does it? You'd have to spend some money to buy the farm, but a farm will make money. After all, this is the end of the barley harvest. An extra farm next year would be really good. And so he hooks the man. He's interested. There's an opportunity for profit here. A good idea. But behind box number 2, who's got verses 3 to 4 and then a number 2 in brackets, because these are all for verses 3 and 4. What's in box number 2, Maureen? Now, which character do we think that might be? I'll put it up on the screen. Which character might that be? That's the older lady, that's Naomi. You'll see when you get the next one. It's all right. Okay. I only had a limited number of animated characters I can use. So Naomi, you see, box 2 is if you buy the land, then you are responsible for looking after Naomi. One more mouth to feed. But the plus sign is Naomi is too old to have any more children. So it's only going to be one mouth to feed. And since it's her family's land, when she dies, you'll get to keep the land. And so he goes, no brainer, I'll do it. At which point Boaz reaches for box number 3. Who's got box number 3? It's there. Yep. What's in box number 3? There's a whole bunch of sheets there. In box number 3 there is... Right, save that one for later. Because I can't change the order of my slides. That's the last one. There we go. So, who's that, do we think? Ruth? You see, the thing is, Ruth is part of the family too. It would be Ruth's children that should inherit the land. Therefore, if you take on responsibility for the family, so in case you were thinking, oh, you also acquire Ruth, that's a bit of an old-fashioned way and an inappropriate way of saying it. No, you acquire responsibility to care for her. And the way of doing that was to take her as your wife and provide family heirs. So if you buy the land, Naomi, Ruth, what was the second picture, Aidan? It's a baby. You see, Ruth is young enough to still have children. Now, that's not just one mouth to feed, that's potentially several extra mouths to feed. He'll lose out if he buys the land. But there's one extra thing. If Ruth has children, picture 3, Aidan? Now, for those who can't see it, it's the same picture of the wheat here crossed out. That is because after he has spent the money to buy the land and to look after the family, the children will count as Mahlon's children, which means the family land goes to them. So he will pay for the land, he will look after Naomi, he will look after Ruth, he will look after all the children, and then he won't even get to keep the land. Box 3 seals it for Boaz, because he goes, the other guy goes, no, I can't afford that. That will ruin my family's inheritance. And so Boaz is left to redeem Ruth. Mr. So-and-so, as we're all going to call him because we don't know his name, has calculated out of self-interest with his business mind, the sensible thing to do is not to redeem. And so Boaz willingly pays the price for Naomi's land. He takes on the responsibility of looking after Ruth and Naomi and any children he and Ruth may have. And he will let the land go back to the family, saving the whole family line from disappearing from God's people and God's land. Redemption is costly. And when we think about how Jesus is the Redeemer that all this is pointing to, and the cost he paid, we can see how that hasn't changed. And we'll think more about that in a moment. Second thing to learn then this morning. Let's turn from Boaz and his meeting to Naomi. Because what happens is that the wedding happens. Children happen. Notice that God is answering the prayer that the town council prayed in verse 11. The elders and those at the gate said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you have standing in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem." Now, praying for a newly married couple to have children is a great thing. It's a good thing to pray at the wedding because children can't be taken for granted. We know that Ruth had been married for 10 years before Mahlon died. No sign of any children. But notice why they're praying for Boaz and Ruth to have children. So that they will build up God's people numerically. So that God's people will increase in number. The arrival of children is a great joy to parents, brothers, sisters, grandparents, and church family. Last week I was just struck as I saw Wendy talk to Logan after the service, her grandson, and the way she was making him laugh. Family is great. Here to Naomi, granny is especially significant. Becoming a granny is especially significant. You see, at the start of the story, she was put in a position where she'd given up hope of grandchildren. All of her own children were dead. She was ruined. Her own husband was gone. And she was struggling to even trust in God. You see, it was a problem because families looked after older relatives when they retired or couldn't work anymore. No one else would. And Naomi was bitter because of the situation she was in, because of all she'd lost. She saw little to no way that it could ever get better. And over the course of the story, we've seen her faith coming back to life slowly, step by step, as she has seen what God was doing in the background and recognized it for what it is. And now, here she is, Grandma. And the women round her say, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a kinsman redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age." You see, Obed is the one who actually redeems Naomi in that sense. Obed is the one through whom their family will continue, through whom Naomi's bitterness when she called herself Mara is taken away. She's the one who will fill her emptiness at the loss of most of her family. Safe at last she is from the ravages of Moab, from the vulnerability of being a widow in that society, and the bitterness of her past. And interestingly, for a story that everyone remembers as a love story, because it is a great story about Ruth and Boaz ending up married, it is chapter 4, verse 15, before we get the first mention of the word love. Does that surprise you? How about this? The word love is not even used about the married couple here. Up until now, the word used to describe a loyal, caring relationship in this story has been kindness, or the Hebrew word hesed. It means a really costly, ever-giving kindness. It's been the kindness of Ruth to Naomi, looking after her. It's been the kindness of Boaz to Ruth. And Boaz describes it as Ruth's kindness to him in chapter 3. It is the word that's covered the kindness of God to all of the people in working through quietly in the background. Someone explained it this way: Hesed is love with Velcro. It's something you can't pull it apart, or it's very hard to pull apart. It sticks. It's a kindness that goes beyond just the legal obligation It's one that's true to the spirit of the law, the idea of looking to care for people, not just doing it because I have to. But the word love here is used to describe the extraordinary commitment of Ruth to Naomi. In Ruth, we see a picture of God's love expressed to us, as well as the love that we are then to show to each other. It's not a fair weather love. It doesn't change in intensity or direction depending on the circumstance, depending on what's going on. It's a love that keeps on going to the very end, a love stronger than death. And even when that love is ignored, and how often do we ignore or take for granted God's love? It's a love that sticks no matter what, as Ruth did with Naomi. And the reason why Ruth was able to do that was because, as we saw in chapter 1, she saw herself as a recipient of God's love. She came to trust in Naomi's God. Your God will be my God, she said. And that's why she wanted to follow him and be a member of his people. So the challenge, as those who have been redeemed, if we have trusted in Jesus, if we have asked him if we have said that out of the kindness that gives and gives and gives, that sent Jesus to the cross for me, please forgive me. How then do we show that love to each other? How are we showing that love to each other? Where does it come from? Well, it should come from knowing Jesus. And it should be seen in his people, how we treat each other, and how we treat others outside as well, how we treat anyone. Redemption, then, is a blessing. It brings great good. Those who are redeemed are fortunate and blessed. But the final picture is that redemption brings hope. Because for one tiny little 4-chapter book, this has a big position in the big story of the Bible. Because the book finishes with a whole list of family names, which I happen to have here. You okay to give me a hand? So if you take that bit and go that way. But it's very easy to rip, so we'll go carefully. Oh, keep going. That's it. And a bit more. And a bit more. Keep going. Don't fall off the stage, but keep going. Nearly there. There we go. Okay. You see, the final thing of what the witnesses prayed for when they prayed for children was not just a child, not just a special child for the family, but one who'd be really significant in God's plan. The book of Ruth, as we said, is about a period where the judges ruled. But it was written much later than that, in a time when actually things were pretty good again in Israel. It was written probably towards the time of Solomon's reign, who was David's son. And you can see I've stuck him down there, slightly out the way. Solomon wrote, "But now the Lord my God has given me rest on every side, and there is no adversity or disaster." See, from the perspective of the time this was written, for Solomon and his people, the book of Ruth shows how God takes an empty and chaotic Israel and fills it and takes away its bitterness, who redeems it, because it was the golden age of ancient Israel. From the dark days of the judges to the great days of King David and King Solomon. All through the line of Boaz and Ruth, because their son was Obed, his son was Jesse, and his son was David. But this is where this book links into even where Ian started our service at the beginning, all the way into the New Testament and the family story of Jesus. Because Ruth's family gets to King David, King David's family goes on to King David's son, Solomon, and from King Solomon onwards we get to King David's greater son, Jesus, who is the one who is our Redeemer. Costly, a blessing, but hope. That's what's part of redemption. Because God has always worked to redeem people. It's not new. So when we say Jesus can be our Redeemer if we ask him to be, that's not because God has just started, I'm going to get into the redeeming business. No, that's because God has always been in that business of taking things that are messed up and making them good again. At great expense to himself. Even through sending his own son to die so that we can be forgiven. Thank you, Ed. We'll just lay this down where it is, I think. Thank you. You can have a seat again. Thank you for your help. You see, this story of redemption is as much yours and mine as it is Ruth's here. You see, we too have behaved in a similar fashion to Elimelech's family, rejecting God as our rightful ruler, wandered off doing what is right in our own eyes, bringing ourselves to the brink of eternal ruin. We too can no more rescue ourselves than Naomi could rescue herself and her family. We need someone to look upon us in kindness, to pay the cost, to bear the cost of what redeeming us will take. And that is a perfect sacrifice, which Jesus taught to be. So, here we are. We were made, created by a loving God who's in the redeeming business. The question is, are we once his because he made us but we still ignore him now? Or are we twice his because Jesus' sacrifice has made provision for us because we've accepted it? Once? Twice? There's no 3 or 4 for this quiz. But we're going to pray together now as we reflect on how great our God is, and since it's Father's Day, how good his fatherly love is. And so as we pray, I've got a little bit of a response